I was just deeply submerged in this subculture. It was this bubble, and that's all that mattered.
This is Joe Wong. Welcome to the Trap Set. I want to play something for you. You're hearing The Party Underground by Redd Kross, featuring my guest, Stephen McDonald, on bass. Formed in 1978 when Stephen was 11 years old, Redd Kross quickly became a fixture on the LA punk scene. Although there have been several aesthetic evolutions, lineup changes, and a hiatus, Redd Kross is still actively recording and touring over 40 years after its foundation. Aside from Redd Kross, Stephen plays with punk heroes Off and grunge progenitors Melvins. He's also produced albums by bands such as The Format and Fun, and worked as an A&R consultant for several labels. The latest Redd Kross album, Beyond the Door, will be available on Merge Records on August 23rd. I spoke to Stephen in downtown Los Angeles. And now my conversation with Stephen McDonald.
From Hawthorne, California.
What did your parents do?
My father is a precision welder. So there's a lot of aerospace industry down there in the South Bay. That's the sort of northern border of the South Bay area of Los Angeles. And Rockwell and McDonald Douglas, they were like where they made a lot of airplane, commercial jets and stuff. But my dad had his own small business where he would be subcontracted, so he didn't work for one of those big companies. He did when he was younger. Had a job at another welding place, but then broke off on his own when I was probably around 10.
Was he from Hawthorne?
No, his father is a Navy guy, so he bounced around a bit. My dad has history of being in Bremerton, Washington as a kid, and with his grandparents in Sacramento. My grandfather was at Pearl Harbor, and then later, at like all the major moments in World War II, he was somehow on one of those ships on the SS Nevada, actually.
Were your parents really patriotic?
No. It was more, my dad is the oldest of like 8 kids. And
Catholic?
Religion wasn't part of the picture.
Oh,
but
really?
No, but it's since some of my other aunts and uncles, one of my aunts seems to be very Catholic nowadays. So I guess that would be the direction that anybody would go in if they decide to get into religion.
Are you guys Scottish?
Yeah, McDonald. It's Scottish or Irish. Those two clans, I guess, intermingled a lot. When I was in Edinburgh 8 years ago, I went looking for my tartan, but it's MC, and a lot of times it's
MAC.
MAC is Scottish often, but I'm just told that first time Redd Kross went to the UK, we were touring with the Teenage Fan Club and the very Scottish dudes from Glasgow, and so would ask him. And at the time, I was wearing a bunch of plaid. I had a plaid outfit that I wore a lot, and we were joking about whether or not those were like warring clans. It already looked like it looked crazy, but it was unclear. Like we could never get. They've just always sort of told us that it's the same.
What about your mom? What was her deal? When you were
Hale. My mom's from a small town in Indiana. Rural Indiana, 60 miles outside Indianapolis. And when she was about 19, she picked up and just drove to LA with no friends, no one waiting for her.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense story that I learned later on.
Like she was getting away from a bad situation?
Yeah, which I didn't know. But it made sense when I later learned, which I probably shouldn't share that much about because I shouldn't. But she's not necessarily a really adventurous person, and I had never really thought about it till later. And then it was like when I learned, I was like, oh, that makes sense. But it was remarkably brave to come from, a tiny town and then just to get into a used car that she managed to scrape money together and just get on whatever that is, Highway 80. I forget which one goes east and west, and just basically till it ends. And then she, in Los Angeles. And she started working as a waitress, and that's where she met my father at a place called Airport Village. It doesn't exist anymore. It was like some kind of food court of sorts, not far from LAX. Yeah.
So they must have met relatively shortly after she came out here.
Yeah, I think she spent. My brother was born in '63. I think that maybe she spent a couple of years, but might have been as little as 6 months by herself before she met my father. And then...
and they're still together?
They are, yeah.
You're smiling broadly.
Oh, because, that scene in... I don't know if you've ever seen this movie. There's a funny scene in a Woody Allen movie, in Love and Death. That's one of my favorite movies for whatever reason. But so it's real slapstick. It's that bridge between the slapstick and then the cerebral relationship comedies. And he's talking about his history and about his grandparents who loved each other as much today as they ever did. And then they cut to these two old people just glaring at each other. Which is not totally fair. They just have an interesting way of, it's just, I can tell that they get on each other's nerves.
50 plus years?
Yes, that's true. Well, my brother turns 56 next month, so they've been married for all that time and together for a little bit longer. So,
how many kids are in your family?
It's just us.
Just you and your
Jeff
brother?
and myself. Yeah.
And what kind of music was on when you were growing up?
Well, just the radio. So
you were born in which year? 67?
67. I was born in May of 67, so I always say I made it in time for the Summer of Love.
So when you say just the radio was on, it was like top 40 radio, FM radio?
Well, FM was when I was... So my first cognitive, memories were... I shouldn't eat on the podcast, I'm just realizing...
Do whatever you want.
Okay, I'll do whatever I want. If I sound mushier mouthed, it's because I've got a donut in my mouth. I'm really kind of becoming conscious or having memories around 70, 71. We've been our earliest memories, and that's the beginnings, I think, of sort of FM radio. Mm-hmm. But in our cars, we just had AM radio. Mm-hmm. My dad had a reel-to-reel. He had a Sony reel-to-reel. His brother went to school in Japan in the late 60s, early 70s and brought back a nice Sansui receiver and some nice Kenwood speakers and this reel-to-reel, I think. My dad might have given him some money because you could get it cheap there then. And I remember my uncle brought back a version of Sgt. Pepper on clear red vinyl.
Wow.
And my brother thinks it might have been like a Chinese bootleg or something.
Probably, yeah.
And I also, thinking about it now, remember the writing on it was all Chinese characters, because now I can actually read a little bit of Japanese, and none of it was the other alphabets, katakana or hiragana. Yes, that's my memory, was all Chinese characters. So, yeah, but point is, my dad had some reel-to-reels, and I remember he had some early Cat Stevens. He had... and he was into like Waylon Jennings.
Awesome.
Yeah, my dad naturally had good taste, but he wasn't like a big music, he wasn't obsessive about it. But the real connection for me and Jeff with music, because we did have like, kind of surprisingly, what's the word I'm thinking of? Whatever, just like surprisingly obscure, or just like, just hard to find records. We had taste for not common records, not popular records at a very young age. We had younger aunts and uncles, and they were rock and roll fans. So our youngest my dad's youngest brother was about 9 years older than my brother, so he was more like an older brother.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in the early '70s, he had a 8-track tape version of Ziggy Stardust, and we borrowed that from him one Christmas, and then never gave it back. And then we had an aunt, his older sister was like 16 in the mid 60s, and she was a screaming Beatles fanatic. And sophisticated taste was the word I was looking for. So for little kids, we kind of had sophisticated taste in music. And so my Aunt Colleen was a real screaming Beatles fanatic, and she actually brought a 3-year-old Jeff McDonald, my older brother, to see the Beatles at Padres Stadium in San Diego in '66.
And when they played in L.A. on that tour, they stayed across the street from where we are right now at the Biltmore Hotel.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I'm always thinking about Beatles landmarks in Los Angeles. There's a booth at the Bob's Big Boy in Burbank. Do you know about that?
No, is that where they sat?
Yes, there's a Beatles booth. And I don't even know if there's a plaque. I think it's just an insider info thing that there's a booth in the back. And that would have been when they had, I don't know, did they ever do any West Coast television performances? You would think maybe they had done a West Coast television performance because it's close to studios there. But there's a booth in the back. And then I know they stayed at a house on Curson. And they stayed in a bunch of Hollywood Hills houses as well. And then famously Blue Jay Way is mentioned.
Right.
And the song Blue Jay Way, and that's a West Hollywood, Hollywood Hills street where they stayed.
When did you start playing music?
I got my first bass when I was 10.
And that was your first instrument?
Yeah.
You turned 10 in
77. Yeah.
And by then, you and your brother had sophisticated taste in music, but you had even more sophisticated taste because you're 4 years younger than your brother. So you're just like a little kid that knows about obscure music.
Well, you would say I was more precocious, but I wouldn't say I was more sophisticated. I think my brother was the truly sophisticated because he's the one bringing the shit home.
Right. I'm saying more sophisticated relative to your age.
Yeah, but definitely more precocious. Yeah.
And was that kind of part of your identity? Like, did you feel like you were the only kid in school that was into this type of music and that was your thing?
Yeah, I was. I mean, it was true. And, and I've heard you, I think you're talking about social signifiers. I heard you use that expression on your podcast. And it's like, oh, that's a good word for it because it was a big piece of my identity or a social signifier of who I was, how I was different.
So who were your bands at that point when you were starting to play bass?
When I started to play bass?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even just on that topic of feeling different than the rest of the kids, I mean, I remember going back to kindergarten and they would maybe play a children's record in the classroom. And I I totally vividly remember being so annoyed that it wasn't Goodbye Yellow Brick Road.
Oh, yeah.
And thinking like, God, it would be so cool if this was some Elton John right now. This place sucks, kind of.
This sucks. Teacher, put on some Lou Reed.
Well, it's funny because that uncle that lent us, that's one of my sort of bragging rights stories, is that same uncle that lent us Ziggy Stardust and we never gave it back, that next Christmas, he actually picked out Lou Reed's Rock and Roll Animal, the live album, with the Hunter Wagner guitar team, and he gave that to me when so that would have been 1973, I think, when that record came out, and I would have been 7 years old. Or
6, right?
6 or 7, and although it, I think it's history has deemed it a good record, but it's not a great Lou Reed record. But it does have songs like Heroin and Sweet Jane on it. So it's pretty interesting.
Why do you think that those artists resonated with you at such a young age?
Well, I mean, I think, a bunch of things. I mean, one is that my older brother, I always, looked up to him and always really wanted to impress him. So there's that, but then there's also just, it was fantastic, magical. It was a magical moment in rock history. I mean, for me, it's still kind of my favorite moment. It's perhaps the golden age of rock and roll. it's this moment where it's been around long enough where there were even people was even starting to feel nostalgic about the beginnings of rock and roll, but they had all this new technology to work with, but it hadn't been overwrought yet. An analog technology is probably at its zenith at that moment.
Yes.
And then, and then there's this new moment in theatricality. People are getting experimental and marrying these two concepts, these art forms. And so that's dazzling, especially to a little kid. Maybe many.
But do you think that the fact that you liked it at that age was simply a product of you being exposed to the music that other kids weren't being exposed to? Or do you think that you had a certain ear that, other children might not have had?
It's probably a combination of both.
Yeah.
The subject matter was definitely not children's subject matter. So that's one of the reasons why kids weren't being exposed to it. Things like, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. That's not for your average, 6-year-old.
But when you're a 6-year-old and you hear that, you don't know what he's talking
Exactly.
about.
It went over my head.
Yeah.
And actually, I've never been much of a lyrics person. Probably, I kind of blame Bowie for it because, I remember Jeff bringing back Hunky Dory, and he's using it's a lot of poeticisms as well, and I remember just kind of tuning out on what the words meant because it all seemed like nonsense, anyways. But I loved the attitude that was being conveyed. Or I remember being into Life on Mars, and I just like the drama, the dance, the tension, and then the release and all that stuff. And
I think Rick Wakeman from Yes was on piano on that one.
He plays piano on that's true. It's a classic moment.
When did you guys cook up the idea to start a band?
So my brother is a real weirdo. I'm not sure if I've quite, just exemplified that yet.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, he was, because I just think that he was the source of, like I said, I was exposed to Hunky Dory when I was 5 years old, but he's the one that brought it home when he was only 8, or 8 or 9. He's the one that would actually read Rock Scene magazine and early versions of Cream. He was reading those writers, and taking it in. Lester Bangs, 8-9-year-old Jeff McDonald was reading Lester Bangs, and actually finishing the article, and then actually going out and seeking it out, and not just accepting that, popular music for people 4 years older than him at that time would have been more like Traffic or something, and Jeff was seeking out the New York Dolls, and he would go to the record shop, he talks about, bringing Hunky Dory up to the record, at the mall, and the hippie girl behind the counter looked at it with a disgusted look on her face, like he was buying pornography, and just and saying, do you know what that is? Do you really want that? And he didn't give a fuck, he wasn't thinking, oh, this person, he didn't care what they thought.
Where did that come from, that attitude?
I don't know. It's mysterious. I plan on having him on my podcast and asking that exact question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you feel like your personality is similar to his, or was he kind of the leader always?
He was, we're older now, so we've gone through so many different phases, and
So the dynamic has changed over the years.
Definitely. He is more of a classic kind of chaotic artistic mind. Mm-hmm. The reason you need a producer, someone to organize this rapid fire influx of idea and concepts, but not necessarily methodical. And then I am more of, I'm kind of boring on that level. Like when first time we did a demo, I always like to talk about this, that, I was 11 years old and the band, Jeff was 15, drummer was whatever. Everybody was, the age range was from 11 to 18. I paid for our demo. We went into a proper studio. I paid for it with my paper route money. And that's kind of been me more so throughout the years. I'm more of the catalyst guy. I'm the one that would put the ad in the paper and get the 9th or 10th drummer and filter through all the cassette submissions and put it together. And we just kind of settled into those roles. That was us early on. Nowadays I produce our records, so that still continues. But and he's just a bit more chaotic, and so I tend to romanticize that and think of it as something a little bit more pure, artistically.
Is it?
I have no idea.
Do you ever resent the role? Like, do you ever feel like you're the babysitter and you wish that you could just be the rapid fire guy?
Yeah. Or be less on top of it. And, but it's funny, like if I could, but I'm also not that, I'm also pretty chaotic too in my own ways too. I think that, as maybe this podcast will exemplify, that it's hard for me to stay on track sometimes. And, but at the same time, what was I even saying? What was the question? Do I resent it? And it's taken different forms, and it's all my different. I'm in 3 different bands currently in my life. I'm in 3 different bands that are serious bands that make records and play shows, and it's the challenge of having shared responsibility is always, at least for me, always challenging. It's always difficult. Even if you don't have sibling baggage, or even if you're not in a marriage and trying to also have a sex life, it's just always, for me, I find it always complicated to share responsibilities with people, to make those negotiations about who's going to do that and then who's going to do this, and who even made this phone call to figure out who's going to do what and do this and that, And it's only been later in my life that I've gotten more comfortable with, like, okay, this is who I am, and I'm comfortable with these roles, you're comfortable with those roles. But the interesting thing is that I think my brother we both continue to evolve, and I think that it's not that rigid who or what we are and what we do, and that we've managed to maintain a certain amount of flexibility and take on different roles throughout the time.
Yeah, I think oftentimes, though, people get into a pattern, when you're in a relationship with someone else, whether it's a band relationship or a romantic relationship or whatever. Yeah. And unless you actively work towards something else, then you fall into the same patterns, for better or worse. Yeah, it's one way that you can actually. It's a productive way too. Yeah. In many cases, it works for a reason. But it typically does end up causing resentments unless you've really designed it super well, and you've thought about all the different reasons that you could end up. And maybe if you're someone that takes on a lot of the organizing for a particular band, well, then you've got to be compensated somehow. And if you've thought about that in advance, then that will buffer against becoming resentful. But it's hard because there's always so many different situations that come up daily, and you never know. It's how you're going to react. And on that topic, Redd Kross has been a band for 40 plus years at this point. There was a 9-year period where we weren't doing making Redd Kross records or doing shows. But yes, but for the more so than not, since 78, first couple of years we were named something else. We were called The Tourists, but since 78 The Tourists is also a really good name.
Well, it was also another band.
Yeah.
It was Annie Lennox and Dave Stewart's pre-Eurythmics band, which we didn't know until we started gigging. So that's why we changed the band name.
And then originally, was it spelled differently too?
Yeah, it's originally just like the American Red Cross, REDCROSS. And then we did a show for the city of Torrance in a park. And also another band that was on the bill was the Salvation Army. And whoever made the flyer decided to alert these other organizations about this. And I forgot about this, but my brother reminded me that when I was in 10th grade, I got a note in class to go to the office, and I had a letter waiting for me from the American Red Cross.
A cease and desist?
It was just sort of, but it was very polite
Yeah.
and friendly. And
Yeah.
and it even suggested just changing the spelling of our name. But it just said it was too confusing. And
That's funny that they would
us to change
that
it.
you would even be on their radar, you know?
Well, it's because the city of Torrance promoted this show.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened with Salvation Army, and they changed their name to the 3 o'clock.
Tell me about the first show that you did as the Tourists.
Well, okay, so as the tour, we did a couple shows with the Tourist, and that's the first ever proper. We played in a backyard party across the street from our house for a couple of like stoners, but that doesn't really count. But then
at the time, did it count? Did it?
Well,
feel...
that did. That was kind of a warm up for
Yeah.
our first actual gig, which was a similar kind of gig, except it was a packed house. And the first proper gig was at an 8th grade graduation party in the Holly Glen area of Hawthorne. Sort of the nicer part. It was not gated, but it was behind a gigantic cinder block wall, the whole neighborhood. And it was at this girl, Lisa Stengel. It was at Lisa Stengel's house. I was just graduating from 6th grade, so it wasn't even my graduating class. It was our drummers, John Stilo, who was the one kid in the neighborhood who played drums. He was in the jazz band and all that for the Weisborn School Orchestra. We were both in the orchestra together, but I was 12 and he would have been pushing 14. And this girl didn't know what kind of band John's band was. He was kind of a popular kid. He could play the Hawaii Five-0 theme, and he, in the orchestra, he would play the drum solo because that's the showcase was during Hawaii Five-0, and he would do a drum solo and then lead into I was on bass, boom, 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 the kind of thing. But so Lisa Stengel asked the popular John Stilo, who was sort of like like a soccer star and whatever, if his band would want to play. But most bands at that time that would play backyard parties were cover bands, like the kind of scene that like Van Halen came out of, where doing Zeppelin covers, Black Sabbath covers, Bad Company and Free, that kind of stuff. And so she had no idea that we weren't going to do that. And
why would she?
Yeah, she would have no reason to know. And so before the gig, we had met Black Flag just prior to that, and no one knew Black Flag at the time by just a series of events.
But they were also in the South Bay at the time.
Yeah, they were in Hermosa Beach. So we're on the sort of northern edge of South Bay, and they're like in the center, only 4 miles away. But we had seen them play at a Moose Lodge, a show they had promoted themselves. And once again, this wasn't happening because a lot of people, no, you're not from Los Angeles. A lot of times people think from other places in the country, like that's just what happened from being in Los Angeles. And this stuff was going on all the time. It was not what was going on all the time. It was weird and rare and bizarre that we found these things. And once again, I attribute it to my brother and his obsession and tenacity. But
so, how did you know to go to the Moose Lodge and see Black Flag?
Well, because Rodney Bingenheimer. One thing I would say we definitely had a leg up was Rodney Bingenheimer's show on K-Rock,
yeah.
which was not the K-Rock that it is today. It was not an important radio station. But we had learned about his show on Sunday nights, which was 10 to midnight. And through Rodney's show, we already knew about the Ramones and Sex Pistols and then the Runaways prior. That's when we got inspired to get guitars and try to do this. Really the Runaways.
Right, because they were young too.
They were only a few years older.
Yeah.
And awesome. And then through that, we learned about Rodney. From Rodney, we learned about the LA punk scene. The first one, like the Weirdos, the Bags, the Dickies. And then, of course, we learned about Danger House Records then, and that was the label that put out all those original bands. And so my brother would ride his moped over the Baldwin Hills Pass to Rhino Records in Westwood, which is the Baldwin Hills Pass. It's sort of like on La Cienega. It's like being on the freeway. It's pretty ballsy. But and he would go get all these records. So anyways, we had heard there was going to be an Alley Cats Rhino 39 show at a moose lodge in Redondo Beach, and that was mind-blowing to us. We probably heard it on Rodney's show. Rodney probably mentioned it. It's like, oh my God, and we could beg our parents to take us to Redondo Beach, and which they did. And then when we got there, the first band that played was this, horrible, like really loud, muddy, just a wash of noise, drunken band called Black Flag. And they had just pressed up their Nervous Breakdown EP, and on the back of it, it had a Lawndale address for SST Records. And my brother just found them in the white pages, called them and said, hey, we have this band. We're all pretty young. My brother's 11. He plays bass. It's very Kim Fowley about the whole thing. And, can we play with you? That's how we try to get gigs. We would just call people through information. We call 411. And
who else would you call?
Jeff remembers getting a hold of John Doe, it's funny. I don't know how he got a hold of John Doe, because how do you call him for me? What do you ask
His
for
name's
John?
Not John Doe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, of course not. And then remember he talked to some of the Dickies. Remember he talked to one of the Dickies' dads. Sometimes you'd get like people's dads.
Yeah.
We called the Avengers in San Francisco because we were just such big fans. But, Penelope Houston, and, hello, in San Francisco, can I have the number of Penelope Houston? Things like that. And then, so at any rate, you're just asking me about our first show. But I'll just tell this backstory a little bit because it's relevant to our first show. So Jeff gets a hold of Greg Ginn and tells him that, my brother's 11, and Greg's laughing. And then he's like, can we play with you? And Greg's like, well, we're rehearsing. If you guys just want to come down into our rehearsal, you can come hang out. And so all of us went as a band to this abandoned church, which has now been written about quite a bit, in Hermosa Beach.
Also, how did you get there?
Well, we had a guitar player now, Greg Hedson, and Jeff was in photography class with Greg, and they recognized each other because they were both taking pictures at punk shows, but that wasn't a youth move. I mean, it wasn't like a teenagers in place at the time yet. It was still kind of like this. All the original punk rockers were kind of leftovers from either the glitter scene, or they were like Cal Arts, art students, art freaks. So still an older crowd, more arty. And but Jeff had been taking pictures of the Go-Go's, and Greg had been taking pictures of the Dickies, I think, and they both recognized these images, and so it was also really random and
then Jeff,
very rarefied.
Jeff ended up marrying a Go-Go.
He did, yeah, that's funny too. Yeah. Which he didn't really get to know her till 10 years later. But yeah, both of us have been groupies all these years. But because I married a musician too, Anna Warrenker. But so Greg Hedson was older. He was 18. He had a little yellow Toyota pickup truck. And I remember being in the back of his pickup truck a lot back in those days when you could just be in the back of an empty pickup truck and not be pulled over. We went down to this church, this abandoned church that these hippies owned, but it was like this battle between the punk rockers and the hippies that SST had waged against the leaseholders or owners of this church, who like made stained glass or something. And so in this this dingy, beer-soaked back room of a church, a very early version of Black Flag did a private concert for us. And that was it was a 4-piece, Greg Ginn, Chuck Dukowski, Robo, and Keith lineup. And then after they were done, they were just like, you guys are a band? Show us. And they handed us their guitars. So I've got Chuck Dukowski's Ibanez Flying V that was as big as I was. And Greg Hedson would have had Greg Ginn's Lucite guitar and his Dan Armstrong. At any rate, so I always joke that we auditioned to hang out with Black Flag. So that was.
What songs did you play?
Well, we had many of our original set of songs at that point already. So in like Annette's Got the Hits and I Hate My School.
Surfers at my school are the biggest friends I
And then I remember very early on, we always did, we had covers too. We did Who Are the Mystery Girls by the New York Dolls was already in our set. And then we had this fun sort of pop punk version, pre-pop punk as a genre, but version of I Want to Hold Your Hand, where we would play the song essentially twice. The first time was in regular tempo, and then click, 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 click.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I got something. The second time around would have been at a Ramones tempo. So that was that. And they were charmed. They thought it was cool. And they were kind of looking to put together a scene anyways, obviously, because they weren't a record label yet, but they had, ambitions of going on tour and doing something.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, SST was eventually Greg's label, but before that it was a radio company. Like
an electronics company, yeah. He made some kind of ham radio thing that Keith used to work on too, Keith Morris. Like Greg would get a little assembly line going of his bandmates, really. People are all soldering stuff. Yeah, so that's what SST was, and that's what we called in 1979, was Greg's little electronics company. So back to Lisa Stengel's.
Yes.
So then Lisa Stengel asked John Steele, the popular kid in school, if his band would play. So we go, and it's this little 2-bedroom track house in Hawthorne. I always describe it just to give a mental image. If you've ever seen the movie Boogie Nights, you might remember in the first 10 minutes of the film when the star character, Dirk Diggler, still lives in home at his parents' house in Torrance. And I always say that the art directors really had it down because it's exactly what this living room looked like that we did our first show. Sort of faux stained glass, matted shag carpet, polyester couch. Mm-hmm. And just a very specific kind of track house.
Post-World War II track house.
Yeah, so these are like late 40s, early 40s track house, but this is 1979. Mm-hmm. And the room is packed with these kids with OP shorts and feathered hair. Now at this point I would say imagine just the extras in Fast Times at Ridgemont High or whatever, and that's the room. It's actually maybe a year earlier. It's pre-Devo or whatever, and at least pre the knowledge of Devo. And these kids were laying our sounds down on our peer group. They're actually older than me, and they were just not into it. They were really bummed and really antagonistic. But the thing I always like to say is that we held our ground, and we didn't stop, we didn't chicken out. And in fact, my brother immediately had just a natural knack, and not even that he wasn't a popular kid at school, but he was always kind of a prankster. So maybe that's why he had this natural ability at dealing with the heckler. And so I remember he said it a couple times, okay, because they're all, boo, play some Zepp, play some Sabbath. And so I was like, okay, this next song is a unreleased Led Zeppelin song, which is funny because for a couple of reasons. And all the kids cheered, yeah, we're going to hear some Sabbath or Zeppelin finally. And two things I think is funny is like, okay, why would they think that we would have access to unreleased Led Zeppelin music? Is that just because, we had electric guitars, therefore, because of that, we're like immediately industry insiders. And then it's also funny just that Led Zeppelin were still a band. This is before Enter the Outdoor, so people were still waiting for their newest record. But we didn't know any Led Zeppelin. We wouldn't know how to play Led Zeppelin, and instead what we did was like a, click, 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 and then just a noise jam, like and it was very sort of like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks, which we were already into. We already were into that sort of no wave thing, and then they listened for a little bit. They're like, yeah, and then they're like, this isn't Led Zeppelin. This sucks. Fuck you, boo boo. And then we did it again, and then we tricked them twice. I remember Jeff was like, okay, sorry. This next one's a Sabbath song. And then click, 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 Anyway, but we held our ground. We played all of our songs. And then after us, we had gotten our new friends to also come down and play. When Lisa Stengel asked John Stilo if his band would play her party, then we immediately just thought, well, let's get Black Flag to play too, because we already knew them. We already knew. I guess it was like immediately like support the scene. We can offer them a show, and maybe they'll offer us a show.
They were like, yeah, sure, we'll play at a middle school kids party.
They're like, yeah, okay. And they came down and they set up their like Sound City stack. Greg Ginn was playing through Sound City stack of Sound City cabs with his PV PA head was his original setup, and loud as all fuck. And Robo had a set of Vista lights, like Bonham size Vista lights, and they were just fucking loud. And but the kids didn't feel empowered to heckle these weird dudes in their mid-20s, like obliterating their living room with sound. So we just sat, and it was just, we got to have another private concert. And so that was that.
When I first started playing shows, I was a little bit older than you. I was probably like 14. And then I started touring when I was around 17. But it made me feel disconnected, even that much more disconnected from school and the other kids that were in my classes. Did you feel that way?
Yeah, part of my transformation and part of my story is that I always think of and I talk about my brother a lot, obviously, especially when we're talking about early Redd Kross, but Jeff was kind of like an angry, troubled kid, like very funny, but very mischievous. And he never liked school. I wouldn't say he was unpopular, but he definitely would have been like the class clown. And he would sometimes do mean things. Okay. I remember like he got a bunch of kids to like all yell lurch in front of some kid's house because there was this gawky teenage girl that is mean shit, And I should also preface that he's the sweetest guy in the world. He is so kind. He would never hurt a fly now. So it's remarkable to think of his trajectory. But when he was a kid, he was angry and troubled. I, on the other hand, was a bit more of like, I could pass as like a popular kid. When I was in elementary school, I was actually voted student council representative for my fourth grade class, which they actually held an election, and I was voted into that. I wasn't like a athlete star or anything, but I would say I was well adjusted, or as much as I could be. But then around sixth grade, we're getting into punk rock. I remember I brought during school on rainy days, you would bring a record to school maybe instead of going out for recess. And I remember bringing the Dickies 10-inch first EP. It's got "You're So Hideous" and "You Drive Me Ape, You Big Gorilla" on it, and all the other kids were playing like Night Fever and Grease soundtrack maybe, and I put on that, and it permanently changed my standing with everybody at that moment. But it was right at the end of the year, so it was like, whoa, I kind of threw everyone off for a second, and then they kind of forgot about it. But then the next year was going to be junior high, so I was leaving my elementary school, and our junior high was comprised of 3 elementary schools in our neighborhood, ours being the lowest on the social economic chain, I guess. So the kids from Anza kind of already were on the bottom of the totem anyways. My school, Juan de Anza, the kids from Peter Burnett or Cabrillo were already kind of just naturally going to have a leg up on the popularity, fitting in thing. When they got to Dana, the middle school, I hope you're getting all this, everybody. But over that summer, there was mass change in my life. That's when we did our first shows. We played out for the first time. We were playing clubs. And I was suddenly fitting in with this group of people. I mean, I was hanging out with Raymond Pettibone, the famous artist, Greg Ginn's brother. And, not just me and Raymond, we weren't super tight, but I was like, this is the kind of crew I was rolling with.
When you were 13.
12.
Or 12, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't even a teenager yet. And during that summer, we would have got our signed to Posh Boy Records and done our first recordings at Shelter Studios, which was Tom Petty's record label. Later, I know this stuff now. And so I was fitting in with a different crew, which meant, and I think back to that time, it was stressful for me. It was really, really stressful. It was exciting. It was very exciting. I always bum people out because they want to be this romantic, amazing moment where I was really confident and badass. And
you were a 12-year-old kid.
I was a 12-year-old kid and keeping up. But I was excited, but I saw the germs. I played with the germs. There's all these amazing things. But so when junior high started, when that next fall, the kids from the other school were not digging the cut of my jib, as you might say, and it was a rude, harsh awakening for me, and I was an immediate outcast, and getting called fag every day. And, just all that crap. And it was, and I didn't even dress weird. I mean, I had the bleach patch in my hair and I'd cut my hair short. I stopped wearing surfer clothes. My mom had, I remember the year my mom would always get, go to Miller's Outpost and get a whole new, stack of back to school clothing, hang 10 OP. It was very sweet. I was lucky to have this stuff. But that was the year, me and my brother were no, none of that anymore. No more. And my mom was just so bummed. What do you mean? I can't take this back? What? So then my new uniform just became, it was very simple. It was just 501s and these plain colored JCPenney's t-shirts. And I would just wear that. That was my look. And I had bleach patch in my hair. Big deal. Maybe I had some punk rock t-shirts, some bands or something, but nothing outrageous at all. But, just by not subscribing to the other codes of normality, not having the feathered hair anymore and whatever, just put a target on your back. And, so I eventually, whatever. The thing I still need to probably do some EMDR therapy over was the day that the 8th grader decided to, in gym class, just, fucking faggot punker. They didn't even know what punk rock was. And then they started beating me up. And then the whole middle school class just watched and chanted,
What did they chant?
I think they chanted Devo at me. Because it was before Whip It had come out, but I think, people knew of Devo because I think they had been on SNL and, because they
did Satisfaction on it.
Yeah,
SNL.
they did Satisfaction and they were on Warner, so they had some kind of presence in popular culture, but they weren't accepted yet.
Did your father-in-law sign Devo to Warner's? I'm just trying. Oh, well, I should mention you. Yeah. So you said that your wife is Anna Warnker,
that's true,
my friend, and her brother Joey has been on this show.
Yeah,
and their father Lenny is an A&R record exec legend
and the record producer.
Yeah,
Lenny Warnker. Yeah. Lenny, I always talk to him about, because my taste in Warner's isn't really, I love a lot of stuff that he was a part of, but, I'd always ask him about the early Alice Cooper records, and it's funny because he'll talk about that stuff sort of we kind of thought of that as kind of like bubble gum. Mm-hmm. That was the stuff that was paying the bills so we could make weird records. Mm-hmm. So I don't really know what his involvement was with Devo, but I don't think... Although Devo wasn't Sire, anything Sire is, I can't believe him, Seymour Stein. Mm-hmm. But I forget who did Devo. But, he has great taste and he knows it's good stuff. So, but yeah. But, and I've since met those guys.
And speaking of Seymour Stein, I would recommend anybody read his book if you haven't read it. It's really good.
Oh, I got to.
It's really good.
I love Seymour.
But anyway, so you've subsequently met the Mothersbaugh.
I was in a movie with them
brothers.
In 1990. I was in a movie called Spirit of '76, and they had a cameo.
Did you tell them that story?
No.
But anyway, so it was traumatic to get beat up at school.
Definitely, and wanted to have the entire PA PE class chanting Devo at you. And a lot of these kids had been my friends in elementary school. Like I said, I was a pretty popular kid, but suddenly those kids were distancing themselves from me.
Well, that's what I'm talking about on this show when I'm talking about how music was such a social signifier.
Yes.
Because at that point, I mean, the messaging that these kids were receiving from somewhere is that, if somebody showed any kind of signs of subversion or kind of, outsiderness or deviation from the mainstream, that they needed to squash it down and distance themselves from it for some reason.
Well, I mean, I think it's also, there's probably so many, I'm not a sociologist. I'm not really, this would be handled better in someone smarter than mine hands. But, I would also think that it's like most of these kids were kind of just headed for, blue-collared work also. And there's really no reason to encourage the creativity of the individual. Right. And and one thing I remember was I think I eventually got picked up and thrown in a trash can, and it was the sort of like the end, the grand finale of this ordeal. And getting out of that, and then I was like, "Fuck it!" Finally, like I'm going to break the code of the playground. I'm going to the office. I'm fucking telling on these fuckers. And I remember sitting in the office and waiting to talk to the principal and listening to the secretaries going back and forth, talking about me in front of me, and they're just saying, "Well, look at him. I mean, it's like he wants the attention." Mm. And like it back to and that right back. I was wearing 501s. A JCPenney's, maybe I wore the maroon shirt that day. Whoa. And then a bleach patch in my hair that probably wasn't that different than yours is right now. It just was different than everyone else. And I remember sitting there hearing them say that to me, and trying to like process that. Like, what? I want this attention? I want that? Are you kidding? It was a fucking nightmare. But like all of life, it's a series of trade-offs, or it's one way you can look at life. And the trade-off was that, and at nighttime I was like doing amazing things. And I was, playing. I mean, someone recently, a friend of ours who didn't take a lot of drugs back then used to journal a lot, my friend Ella Black. And I also played in her band. She had a band called Ella and the Blacks. Even early on, I was doing double duty sometimes. And she had this like sort of pre-funk band and pre-sort of white boy funk, punk rockers. Like we did a cover of Rapper's Delight. I learned how to play the bass line to Rapper's Delight when I was 12.
Mm-hmm. Which is the bass line from Good Times, of course.
Kind of, yeah. And but anyway, so she journaled a lot, and she wrote about the night that the first time we did a show at the Hong Kong Cafe, and David Bowie showed up to check out the punk scene in LA. And this is 79, so it would have been like Lodger era Bowie. And, and at the time, so I don't have all that vivid memories of these moments. I remember, and then it started to ring a bell, but at the time, I mean, nowadays I'm sort of like, you could tell me that and I can sort of imagine that I remember it too. I don't know.
You don't have like a vivid memory of meeting him or anything?
I did not
like
meet him,
no.
but what she wrote about was the fact that Craig Lee of the Bags, that everybody was being really cool, that it was a Black Flag Redd Kross show, and Bowie shows up, and that everybody was being really cool, and it wasn't crowded, and once again, like that early scene was all leftover kids from the glitter scene or art students, so Bowie was their god, So this dude's in this small little Chinese restaurant, probably 100 other people. Everyone's being cool. But then Craig Lee of the Bags eventually made contact and sort of let him know, probably in so many words, that, we're all fans. And then he bails. But I say that still, I tell that story just to exemplify that, that was my first show at a nightclub. Mm-hmm. And, one of the regrets of my life is I never saw Bowie, who had a huge impact on me. But by the time I would have had a chance to see him, he was playing it was already Let's Dance kind of era and whatever. So back to that social signifier.
He was playing with the musicians that played on that were in Chic, which later went on to become...
awesome. I mean, I would kill to have gone to that now, you know, but back to the social signifier that's so important that it's exactly the way you believe in it,
right.
You know, to get behind it. Like I had actually turned on Bowie I turned on him after Young Americans. I didn't get back into him. Like that night, if someone had said Bowie was there, I might have even had my head up my ass about it.
Right.
Because I didn't realize yet until after punk rock that I needed to recheck out Low, Heroes, and the record that he was working on then, Lodger, to have my mind blown again. But at any rate, but the joke I tell is that one of my greatest regrets is I never saw Bowie, but there's a very good chance that Bowie saw me play. And I don't know if that story's true, but that's according to Ella Black's journal from that era, that's the night Bowie showed up.
By this point, early 80s, what were your ambitions for the band?
I always, it was blind ambition, but I just always, I always was very driven.
Did commercial success seem incompatible with your belief system at the time?
Well, it just doesn't seem like a reality. I mean, it didn't seem like a possibility, I mean, the commercial music in 1980 is, Fleetwood Mac.
Devo, though, yeah.
Sure, Devo break through with Whip It. They do, that's true. And I unplugged from them at that point, too. Like I remember a very meaningful moment in my life was when Darby Crash died. Mm-hmm. And that's the same week that John Lennon died. And I grew up on the Beatles, loved the Beatles, but Darby Crash's death meant a million times more to me at that moment. So I was just deeply submerged in this subculture, and it was this bubble, and that's all that mattered. To me, like the biggest, I had seen Blondie at the Santa Monica Civic and Patti Smith at the Santa Monica Civic. Blondie would have been on Parallel Lines, but it was before Heart of Glass had been a single. Mm-hmm. So they were still it was the very tail of them being this cool underground band. And Santa Monica Civic is a couple thousand people, maybe 3,000 people. Like that to me would have been, although I saw Kiss, I saw Zeppelin when I was 9 at the Forum. But I had this new sort of focus. And that was about as big as it got, and that was mind blowing. But for me, just to play a nightclub was, I think of...
Were you having a lot of fun at the time?
Yeah, it was mind blowing, but it was extreme. There was so much going on in my life, I mean, part of my story I've talked about it before. I think it originally got written up in with that Timmy O'Hannon magazine, the San Francisco punk rock. I forget what it's called, but I ran away from home when I was 13. I got into a physical relationship with a person twice my age. This woman that was, I guess, looking back, she was a pedophile, but mostly just crazy, and or also just garden variety crazy, rather.
Right.
And but an insane, great taste in music. Turned me on to the Velvet Underground, and there was just so much going on. It was an extreme time in my life.
Were you doing any drugs or drinking?
Yeah, I took acid when I was 12.
Mm-hmm.
I talked a very well-known person in the music world now. He used to hang out with Black Flag, and I don't know if he was making it, but he had it, and he kind of did their sound for a long time. That's all I'll say about him, because I know he's a little uncomfortable about me talking about the story, but... I hit him up. I was like, come on, let me have some. I'll buy it. Come on. And he's like, And I was 12, and so he sold me a half a hit, or gave me a half a hit. I took it then. So, and I wanted, and that wasn't just wanting to fit in, and that wasn't people pressuring me. that was coming from me.
Right.
I wanted it. I wanted to be older than I was. I wanted to grow up faster than I was growing up. I wanted to be free of the rules and the restrictions of my day life.
Do you think that it had any adverse effect on your development as a person, sleeping with a 26-year-old when you're 13? Or was it, I'm honestly asking, like, was it bad?
Yeah. It was really bad because the main thing was that it fucked up my family. It was incredibly painful to them. I one day didn't come home from school, and then I was gone for 3 months.
Wow.
And my parents had to go through this really painful process of trying to find me and dealing with the authorities and being treated like they had, abused me, and it was traumatizing. And the story, just a little backstory about that, was just that, so she was kind of crazy, and my parents sort of found out through my journals in school that our relationship was more than just best friends, that there was a physical component to it. They had read my journals. And when they learned there was a physical component to it, they told me I had to break up with her. And so I tried to break up with her. I tried several times. And then she eventually told me that she was pregnant and she was going to have my child if I didn't run away with her. So...
Was she lying?
Who knows? But so and then right at the same time, Darby Crash killed himself. And she'd always tell me that she had this other lover, which I didn't know he was gay. He was my idol. She probably knew him. It was, a little bit acquainted with him, and obsessed with him. Also obsessed with Bowie together, I'm sure. But, and so when Darby killed himself, she had me believing it was over our relationship. And then, and I tried to not go. So her crazy mother and mother's boyfriend concocted this plan for us to run away to Las Vegas. They picked up their lives, went to Las Vegas, and this guy took me with him. Yeah.
So the thing is,
you asked me a very simple question, and I threw that.
No, but this. If this is the kind of people that she had for parents, of course she's fucked up.
Yeah, definitely.
Her parents were presumably in their late 40s or 50s at that time.
Yeah.
And they thought it was a sane idea to get a 13-year-old kid and bring him to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
I mean, that's even crazier.
I know. It's something for it always seems very cinematic. The idea, it seems like some kind of Scorsese, crazy story of these weirdo characters. But... and also it wasn't her father, it was her mother's boyfriend.
Yeah. Well,
they were whatever.
Even for any adult to think that's a
that
good
detail
idea.
Matters right now.
Yeah. How did it resolve?
My parents eventually found, so my brother was friends with her, and this girl was part of the scene, know, and then I disappear. And everyone's freaked out. And this is around the time of the Hillside Strangler. Kids in school thought I was killed by the Hillside Strangler. And then Dee was her name. Dee was like, oh my God, I have no idea. But then all of a sudden they picked up a week later. She picked up a week later. And first Jeff kind of was believing her. But then when they suddenly left, they knew. Mm-hmm. They knew, because we had a very obsessive relationship. It was it was obsessive. And it reminds me of that movie Heavenly Creatures, that Peter Jackson film or something, just crazy obsession.
Do you fault your parents for being overly permissive?
No, they were very busy, and no. What would I say for that situation that I was in? Well, no, because we were really relentless, my brother and I. Mm-hmm. Notice I always say we, so that I still trying to figure out how to individuate myself. But, we were just so in love with what we were doing. We were so in love with the scene. And my parents, I think, as much as they weren't like artistic types, they had the wherewithal to acknowledge that these kids had a passion.
Yeah.
And that was something to be valued.
Yeah, I always felt the same way. Like, I'm really grateful that my parents let me do what I wanted to do. But now when I think about going on tour, as a minor, it's kind of crazy that they let me do that. And I'm glad they did.
Yeah. Yeah, we went to trips to San Francisco, Jeff and I, and when I was 12 or 13 and bummed around on the streets. And it's like, wow, that was crazy.
Well, now you have a 10-year-old, right?
Yeah.
So how is your parenting style informed by the way that you were brought up, and how is it different?
How is it informed by the way I was brought up? How is it different? Well, luckily we have, how is it informed? I think that I'm trying to teach my son the work ethic that my parents have. I'm trying to should lead by example with that one, because it's also like, I don't know how you teach work ethic also, because I'm not a taskmaster, but I'm hoping that he sees that if you do something that you believe in, that, basically just this idea that anything worth doing is always hard. It usually takes a lot of time and effort. And he's really into basketball right now. And I'm just trying to encourage him to if you really love it, it's a lot of work, So there's that. There's the work ethic. And then how is it different? Well, where, this kid's not going to be alone anytime soon. Mm-hmm. He's 10, but just yesterday, we reunited with some old friends from preschool, and he saw a friend he hadn't seen since preschool, and we were on Larchmont in a very populated area, lots of shops, and the other dad said, "Oh, the two should just go on. They should just go to the ice cream shop down the road, and we'll catch up." But it was definitely the first time he's ever been that many yards away from one of his parents or a babysitter, and I asked him later, how did that feel? He's like, weird.
Because I think about when I was 10, I would just get on my bike and ride for miles.
Me too.
And I think statistically speaking, the world isn't more dangerous now than it was when you were a kid in the 70s. In fact, it might be safer in some ways. But the culture has changed. And it's maybe gone, in my opinion, as somebody who doesn't have kids and isn't really that qualified to make this statement, but maybe it's gone a little bit too far in the direction of children having their lives curated, especially here in LA.
Sure. Well, but the other thing is we live in the hills.
Yeah.
So it's not, he didn't.
There's not sidewalks where he can just go out.
And there's not we're not just but luckily we do actually have some neighbors across the street, and there's a little bit of that, And I guess I'm going to Otis's house. There's a little bit of that, but not that much. And it is, definitely play dates where you drive them and you're part of it. And, so there's more of that, but so some of it's just for logistical reasons that it can't be that, and that makes me kind of sad. But also we're in the Hollywood Hills, and then the first neighborhood, right when you get sort of out of the hills, it's still a little sketchy, it's a little dicey. I wouldn't want him. He's got to be a teenager before he's navigating that area for my taste.
Yeah, like Franklin Village.
Yeah. And then just a little bit further down is Hollywood and Bronson.
Yeah, it's
where all the homeless teens are.
Yes.
And but he's seen a lot of it already. Every day driving to school, we've had to have pretty deep conversations about homelessness and the way other people live and stuff.
Mm-hmm. When do you think you'll tell him about your childhood?
Well, it's funny. We've been listening to a lot of podcasts lately, so I'm thinking this one he won't be listening to. He doesn't really want to know. Every once in a while I'll talk to him because the thing I always sort of say to him is that I think the big difference for me is just always been let's just enjoy this. There's no rush.
Yeah.
There's no rush.
You know what? When I was a kid, I felt that same rush that you felt. I want to be part of the scene. I want to be with the older people. Yeah. And I don't know why. I think it's because when I got a drum set it was like a vehicle for me. Like lots of people describe having a car as being their entree into the world of being an adult or something.
Yeah.
For me, it was like once I could make that noise by myself, I was like, this is what I want to do. I felt like it was
empowering.
Yeah.
It's empowering. And then you also know that it's the gateway to another world.
Yes.
And I did want to find that other world, you know. I didn't like what was being offered to me in the confines of the suburban Pleasant Valley Sunday or whatever of, South Bay, 1970s, Southern California. And, and then Jeff and I just really had, I had a lot of gateways, I was hooked. I saw Kiss at the Forum on the first Alive record when I was 8 years old. And when they were still like for teens, like a lot of people I know, a lot of people my age saw Kiss as their first band, but they saw them on Dynasty, like after I Was Made for Loving You, and it was already like a kiddie bop thing at that point.
Time. Yes.
And this is before then. This is still like teenager music. And, and my parents, and once again, we lived close to the Forum. So our parents would drop us off at the House of Pies, and they were cool about it. But of course, we were relentless. We insisted. We begged, and then, and so I just, but yeah, the rush, the wanting to be, I guess it makes sense. And it's also why it's important for me to choose my battles when I say no, because if you're saying no about everything, eventually it's just like, I got to grow up faster. The kid's going to go, I got to grow up faster. I got to grow up. And even though they did say yes about a lot of stuff, obviously, but just more like little things like, like a nervous mother and you happen to be a kid that is constantly bouncing your leg because you're going through puberty. Stop doing that. Things like that. Just constant, like neurotic rules about, table manners. Things like, well, I'm not going to be eating with the Queen of England anytime soon, so I don't give a fuck if, if you're holding a fork like this, or...
It's more like social conditioning at that point.
Yeah, it's just like caring what other people think.
Right.
So much that, I think for me that was a bit oppressive.
Social conditioning under the guise of politeness.
Yeah, right. So that was super oppressive, I think, being socialized.
And just having, trying to adhere to rules that feel arbitrary.
And then also not just my parents, so the arbitrary rules of my parents, but then also just what was popular with amongst my peers, and just feeling insignificant amongst my peers, and just having that feeling of somewhere else is for me, or that elsewhere they can recognize that I'm special. Here you don't know, and needing to feel that. I think we all need to feel a little special.
Did you end up graduating from high school?
I did. My brother didn't.
But so you went back after this whole thing in Vegas?
Yeah. I came back. I was back into 8th grade. Yeah.
Did you get to a point in the 80s or 90s where you felt like Redd Kross had achieved your original vision for it?
Well, there was never an original vision. We just always...
Well, you were talking about seeing bands play at the Santa Monica Civic and how that was kind of like the ultimate. Did you ever... Did that stay a goal, and did you
Well, it was always a goal to be like a headlining band that had their following, and I think the stakes increased in time as we saw peers maybe we get the sense of what was possible. I remember the first time I really felt like I was ready in high school. When I was about 16, we were starting to sell out clubs or do well, at the Troubadour, and we had a good drummer from a heavy metal band at this point. Heavy metal.
Was that Victor or somebody else?
Victor was later. This guy named Glenn Holland, and at the time around early mid 80s, not hair metal, but you would sort of punk rock was a bit more homespun, and it wasn't so maybe on the East Coast, the DC thing was a bit more chops oriented, but metal, you would respect these people. You maybe didn't like it, but you had respect for their craft, that these people actually knew how to play, and didn't mean that necessarily that's what you wanted to do, but you at least knew that you might have had more respect for their musicianship. And we had this metal drummer at this point, and we just got into a better place, and I remember we could play a pretty convincing Kiss cover at this point, and I wanted to play at my high school. I thought that would finally get some respect. But at that point, it was like around 84, and Run DMC had the hit with Walk This Way, and they were no longer having bands play at the band shell or whatever during lunch. It was all DJs, and it was probably some really amazing early mid-'80s freestyle rapping going on.
Yeah.
But I didn't have any love for it. I was just jealous that my band didn't get to play. But I think that would maybe be a symbol that I thought we were getting somewhere. That was something where I thought that as a musician, because it's an environment that you're going to have to show up the next morning. Mm-hmm. It was a place where, and at least it's showing that I felt I could impress the layman. I could impress someone that knew nothing about music. They could think that, oh, that guy knows what he's doing. I guess he really is, someone that I should respect.
And when did you guys sign with Atlantic?
That was around 90. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because at this point we had, by 80,
been a band for 12 years.
Yeah, we'd already put out a few records on indie labels, and before we signed with Atlantic, we had toured not internationally, but nationally a few times, and 85 was our first national tour. Then 87 or 86, we put out a record called Neurotica and did a lot of touring around that one. And then, Atlantic would have been 1990.
Did it feel like a big change?
To be on Atlantic?
At that time, major labels were much different. It was a big deal. You're on Led Zeppelin's label, Aretha Franklin's label.
Yeah. We're on, 30 Rockefeller Plaza is the address on the label. And, we had the same label as the Zeppelin records, literally on your record. Mm-hmm. And all that. The thing for me was, I remember I just felt like, I don't really know what this means. Like, how are we supposed to relate to millions and millions of people when I didn't like mainstream music myself? Mm-hmm. Like, how is this going to, and then also feeling like, but don't be negative because you're going to tank it if you're negative.
Right.
So trying to have an open mind. I hadn't studied philosophy. If you haven't already noticed, I'm not really an intellectual, so I didn't study.
Did you go to college?
No.
Okay.
No, straight out. I've barely finished high school with bare minimum, and then out of high school, I went on tour. So I hadn't read any philosophy. I didn't know about Stoicism. I didn't know to be potentially one path you could take was, say, Buzz Osborne, one of my bandmates in the Melvins. His philosophy when he got signed to Atlantic was, really? If you want, I'm not going to stop you, but if it doesn't work out, that's on you, not me.
You think that was his real philosophy, or was that like a defensive posture?
Who knows? But that's how he tells it now.
Yeah.
And I know that for me, I refused to be pessimistic. I even recognized it then, was that to have any kind of shield like that I thought of it as chickening out also. Mm-hmm. Like, I have to put myself on the line here, and even if it doesn't work out, even if I get my feelings hurt, at least I'll know I've tried really, really hard. I guess I just had a fear of regret of not trying. Mm-hmm. And but then, of course, what ended up happening, we were on and off the label within a year. Then we had a stigma attached to us from that point, and the way I see it now, at least, is that the industry sort of viewed it as, okay, so someone took a chance on them, they got their chance, and they don't connect with the masses. Just everybody knows they don't connect, so don't consider them anymore. And so it was done. Like, by the time I was 22 or 3, I'd already had my shot at breaking through to mainstream, and there was a stigma attached, and and that was a weird feeling to be on and off a label within a year. And, so that was an interesting part of my hit. Well, and the other thing I was trying to say is I internalized that. I definitely felt like I had failed. So I allowed myself that vulnerability of trying. But then the downside is when it doesn't work, how are you going to deal with that feeling? And so you might feel like a failure. You allowed yourself to feel like a failure. And then you get that, you get a lot of that affirmation from the outside world, from the business side.
Right.
The business side. And, and that was hard. It took a long time to get over that. But then
So wait, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to 23-year-old Stephen while he was going through this? Like, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself?
I'm trying to think if it was any different than anything that anybody else had done, told me. But yeah, I mean, I would have said things that to encourage him to not internalize that, to encourage him that it's marketing and it's timing a lot of times, and that there are other reasons so many reasons that are so far out of your hands. When people, because there's different philosophies and I don't really know what they are, even though I've worked at record labels even. Some people believe that the audience determines whether or not something's good. If you go to a record label and A&R meeting, they're going to say, if it's great, the audience will let you know.
Yeah, ask Van Gogh about that.
Sure, right. And that's what somebody says. That's what some smartass might pipe up and say. And then the CEO might think, touche. Right. And then thinking like, I would really like,
yeah.
But they also think, I'd really like to fire that guy about now.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like there's a reason why McDonald's and Subway are the most popular restaurants in the United States, and that renowned chefs are struggling to keep their businesses afloat many times. And it's not because McDonald's and Subway's product is superior. It's just because it's engineered to appeal to the masses.
Sure, you mean the food itself or the marketing?
The whole thing.
Yeah. They know how to find their market.
I mean,
on
I
every
will
level.
say McDonald's French fries are fucking addictive.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a reason. I get it. It doesn't mean that it's healthy food that is good for you or a work of art necessarily.
It's true.
Maybe it's pop art, but
yeah, So it's hard to say, and it's like, the other thing about me was that I would have never had a problem with, being the McDonald's of music. It was not like a thing. We didn't have this highfalutin idea, although we were but it always had to come from us. That's for sure, And the thing that happened with that record was that my brother kind of got into this idea of like, he's thinking like the masses, what do I do? And he gets really into like bubblegum music from the early 70s. He's listening to this Casman Katz records, like yummy, 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 I got love in my tummy, and things like that. And he's singing like, and that's where
he's a subversive version of that. Yeah,
that's where he's heading musically,
yeah.
And which is fun and cool, but it's not necessarily like, the biggest record that year was probably a Spin Doctors record, the biggest record in a rock world, in 1989 when we were writing the record, or whatever. I mean, the only thing that we could all identify that we loved as a band that was popular at that moment was we all loved Cosmic Thing by the B-52s. And even though some of the production was still kind of like, it's a little cheesy, but the songs were just awesome, and even Love Shack. And, but, and I guess there was Jane's Addiction and Guns N' Roses had a big success, but I was very competitive with those bands, and I was not really going to give it up quickly to them. But I wanted to compete with them, and I wanted to compete with them on my own terms.
After the band went on hiatus,
it
seemed like you got more into producing other people's records, and weren't you even?
Just so really quickly, so I said we didn't go on hiatus after
Not
Atlantic.
Right after that, yeah.
No, we went and we went to England. We got to go to England. We did two more records where we really tried to break through from that market and then get re-imported back to the States. So there's whatever. So there's a record called Phase Shifter and a record called Show World. And we did, and those are good. And I was really much prouder of those records. I also believe if Phase Shifter had come out at the time of Third Eye, maybe things would have a little different. Who knows? Timing, it's weird, whatever. But so I'm sorry, talk about the hiatus.
Well, I want to hear more about your forays into producing for
Yeah.
other artists, and then didn't you work at a label as well as
I worked at a bunch of labels.
Yeah.
I was a consultant, and I eventually worked in the office as an actual executive.
Which labels?
Well, my father-in-law, Lenny Warnker, help me get into the business, and he had me consult for him at DreamWorks. So I did that around 2002, maybe. That's where I started, but then I eventually got my own jobs after that, and I started consulting for, I consulted for Craig. Oh my God, I can't forget his name. These people are still out there. But I consulted at Atlantic for Mary Gormley. I consulted at, and then eventually at Universal. Universal Motown for my friend Andrew Kronfeld. And I did that for quite a while. And I really loved the consulting. It was so much fun. I loved the going to gigs, getting paid to go to gigs. At that point, I very much felt entitled to getting paid to go to a gig.
What did consulting entail? You would just go check out new bands and give your opinion on it?
Yeah, I felt like my kid has since got me into sports. I never liked sports, and he got into basketball, and then he realized, oh, and NBA is awesome, but if you really want to find out where the new talent is, you got to get into college, or if you get really intense, then you'd be going to the high schools. And that moment of discovery, and seeing talent on the raw, and knowing that you have a good enough sense of it from your own experience, how to spot that talent, and being excited about the idea of finding talent on the raw and then coming up with ideas of how best to nurture it. And maybe those were very idealistic, highfalutin concepts that were just justifying my being involved in something that's also, questionable, major labels. And, but they have been throughout times, but I don't also subscribe to the Steve Albini philosophy that it's all just completely unscrupulous, and that the musician that's now the A&R guy is really just a pawn to trick you into thinking that they're groovy when they're really not. I think that I was bringing something interesting and smart to the table, and I loved that. It was fun to discover talent, and I thought just needed to be nurtured the right way, and that maybe then. Then the bigger ideal for me was I would love to be someone's guardian angel, be like the guardian angel I never had, but ultimately ended up being a bit idealistic because I was never in a position to not have so many bosses where I could actually guard someone.
Right.
But at the same time, it was neat to try to direct resources towards the places you really believed deserved the resources. So... it was a fun time. It was a fun time of discovery, and it was also fun to be social without the responsibility of being in a band, not having to worry about whether or not I was going to lose my voice before the gig, and the latter years of Redd Kross were very sober years. We were really very serious and focused on a certain goal of obtaining a certain amount of something. And, we were just teetotalers during all of the 90s. I'd never drank or anything. And I was just really hyper-focused and through the late 80s and all of the 90s. So it was kind of fun to go have a beer with a band, just hang out and feel like I had some wisdom to share a little bit too, And it's funny, I think about some of that stuff now, because now that I'm back out making records and dealing with whether or not Mojo gave me a 3-star or a 4-star review again. And I remember telling some band, I can't remember the name of the band, but I remember I was just so pissed. And I was don't let those fuckers get you down. It's they give you a shitty review. A lot of times it just has to do with who they partied with the night before. And if your person's not partying with the right person, so don't internalize that.
Yeah.
Which is maybe just a very...
Which is what you would tell yourself.
Yes, so those kinds of things.
There's no
You recently reached out to me because you're starting your own podcast.
Yes, yeah, I call you you're my podcast sponsor.
Okay. Well, what was the impetus to start your own podcast? But I should mention, right now you're playing in 3 bands, as you alluded to before.
Yeah.
Your Redd Kross is back and active.
Yep.
Then also you're playing bass with Melvins.
I have been for 3 years.
Yeah, and also for the last, 10 years or so, you've been playing with Off.
Yeah, Off started in 2009, so it's 10 years, yeah.
So you're active as a musician.
Yeah.
Why do you want to start a podcast?
Well, I think I'm always trying to create more opportunity for myself, and then there's also a part of me that gets a little isolated. I'm on the road so much now, and I've always been a pretty social person, and I mean it makes sense. I'm 52. Like now that I'm home, now when I'm on tour so much, when I'm home, I just want to stay home with my kid and my wife. Those relationships are doing great from that, but it also starts to get a bit isolating. And, I guess there's probably some FOMO where I feel like there's some, there's parties out there and everyone's like doing things and really interacting with each other in ways that I used to. I wish I was. And a lot of that's fantasy, and there's always fear of missing out of things that aren't really there. But I think in a lot of ways, I just kind of want to reconnect with people. I should mention that when I was doing A&R a lot, I really developed this very strong friendship with a guy named Franz Fleischle, who was an A&R guy. And so much of that time, I think back to it fondly because we became very close. And it was the first time sort of in my adult life that I had a peer that I wasn't in a band with, and we would just have these crazy wild experiences together, like meeting Arcade Fire for the first time, where we like got in there and we're ahead of the pack, and now I'm still friends with those guys. And I love what their career has turned out to be. And it was bonding, but my friend, he developed epilepsy and MS at the same time, and then had a series of really bad seizures, and now he's just not, he couldn't work anymore, and he's still around, but he's very compromised. So that relationship is really, it's very one way now, and we're still very tight. We talk a lot, but I'm missing some of that. There's a void in my life. I need to find that connection, a two-way connection with some more people. And I just start thinking like, I should reach out to people that I've known for years. But at this point in your life, it's harder to just randomly reach out to someone in their 40s or 50s and be like, I want to go talk for an hour or want to hang out.
That's not more common in our society.
I mean, and maybe that's also, because religion isn't there so much anymore. And maybe that's one of the reasons why religion was there, or
sure,
and I just don't find myself going out to shows, like, which is my sort of my religion, because so maybe that's why I got to be more social that way too. But also,
even at shows, you don't have an opportunity to really
get a little deeper
with somebody for an hour and a half.
Yeah, I like to go deeper. I want to go deeper. Also, my hearing is a little fucked nowadays, so I need the room to be kind of quiet. I don't want a bunch of things going on around me. I'd like to have a quieter moment with someone, and so yeah, the idea behind my podcast is just that I'm so loosely acquainted with so many people. I'd like to become more acquainted, and just thinking that might be interesting to other people. And then the other byproduct would be just that my name would maybe be on people's minds more and be more possibilities for all the different things I do, which I've also scored things, and I've done songs for television commercials, and I've acted, and I do a bunch of different things, and I love the things that I'm doing now, but I just feel like I might as well, because I've always resided, I really have resigned myself to staying in the underground now as a rock musician, but I think that I would still like to fuck with popular culture a bit more, and maybe there's other arenas where I'm part of that conversation, that cultural conversation, and as they might say, and maybe there's something there, obviously. And then the Melvins started a podcast a while ago, and I'd always thought about doing a podcast, but they started a podcast, and one of the people they interviewed was the drummer of Soundgarden, Matt Cameron, And I got to be a part of that one, and it was fun. And at some point, Matt had said off mic, he said, "You have the gift of gab," and which I think he meant as a compliment. And I just know if I'm interested in a topic, I have fun asking those questions. I have fun interacting and relating to other individuals that way, and it makes me feel a little less like it's just salve for that isolation. And I want, you and I have talked about this before, this sense of community that can come out of these things. And I just know when I'm not feeling connected, I tend to go to a dark place, and where I can not be as excited about doing stuff for myself too, not feel a part of.
Yes.
I'd just like to change that.
Well, I would say that this podcast has been a catalyst for my life in all the ways that you're hoping yours will be. Although we could sit here and talk for another hour and a half, and there would be lots of great stories, folks should head over to your podcast when it's available, and then they can find out more about you.
That's funny. Yeah, I was thinking that it might be, what do they call that when they have a TV show and another show comes off a TV show?
Spin-off?
Yeah. It was almost like I could be a spin-off.
Sure. Well, Stephen McDonald, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me.
The Trap Set is produced by me, Joe Wong, along with Chris Karwowski, who also edits the program. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Trap Set, and visit our website, thetrapset.net, to subscribe to our show for free. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please donate to our show. If you can't afford to donate, please tell a friend and give us a good rating on iTunes. Send your feedback and guest requests to thetrapset@gmail.com.